Dear friends and dear colleagues, good morning to all of you. We are now moving towards wrapping up what have been 2 very rich days of discussion on our symposium, The Future of Work We Want. As I have said at the opening session, this is not a typical ACTRAV symposium with a very big number of participants. We've decided to make all the participants active in the program at a certain moment in time, and you've all done that. Some colleagues have already had to leave. And like we have said as well, this is not one where we're going to table conclusions that you all take with you home and then put on a shelf. That's not the objective. The objective here is to draw some points that have come out in the discussions, that have come out in the different dialogues that we have organized, but that have also come out in the regional conferences, in the 5 regional conferences that we've had from May until September. So you will all get a copy of what I'm going to introduce now. You will get it afterwards, not today. We're in the process of translating it into French and Spanish, so I expect that early next week. We've got the 3 language versions, and we will send them to everyone who's been working with us in a very professional but also a very committed manner in the course of these 2 days. It's also my big pleasure to have with us this morning Luc Cortebeeck. He is now the Vice President of the governing body, and he's President of the Workers' Group of the ILO. I mean, Luc is someone everyone in this room knows for many years. And then on my right-hand side, someone who does not need to be introduced, the Director-General of the ILO, Guy Ryder. And I'm very pleased to have the 2 of them with us. And I will ask them to comment on what we have highlighted as the main findings of our discussions. So I'll move on to that. What I'm going to do is to introduce to you in 3 different chapters, I would say, what we have learned and what we want to share following the discussions. The first set of issues is what I would call the state of the art. Why are we here? Why are we discussing the future of work and the challenges around it? So what's happening in the world of work that is influencing the issues that we've been discussing? Then a second part on the main points that were flagged up in the course of our discussions these 2 days. And I have to say that maybe some of you will feel that we're not being faithful to everything that's been discussed. That's not the aim. It was really a matter of choosing what we found in our small drafting group to be the most relevant points that we wanted to bring out in the open. This does not mean that the other points are not going to be taken on board, because there will be a full report of the discussions in the course of the 2 days, and it will be accessible as we are preparing also an edition of the discussions that we had in the regions, not just the fact sheets that introduce the situation in the regions, but also the highlights that we have done at the end of each one of the regional conference. And then the third part is, where do we go from here? I mean, is it the discussion on the future of work closed because we've done the regional conferences and then symposium? Of course not. And we're going to say that this is the start of the process, but we have identified 6 points which we would like to be an agenda for us to go on and to move on from here at all relevant levels. We have a responsibility inside the ILO. You have a responsibility in your own national organizations if we're talking about the trade union leaders present, but also the academics that have been with us have a specific responsibility regarding what they can do in their capacity to influence and to move the agendas where they are present as well. And I'm still looking for our Undersecretary of State from Uruguay with us. And governments also have a responsibility on pushing forward the agenda. So this is, I would say, homework for all of us when we get out of here, and where do we move in the next stage. So let me move to the first points, which is, I would say, the state of the art, very briefly, and we have identified 4 specific points, and they're the drivers that we've been discussing, both in the regional meetings and here at the symposium. The first one being globalization and the impact that globalization has had in the world economy, the fact that economies are much more interconnected, and the implications this has on the way work is organized and the way production is organized. And this is something which is happening in the developed and in the developing countries. This is not something that only hits one part of the world, it hits the whole world. And also the fact that we all recognize that globalization has been a driver of economic development. We've also said, and everyone agrees to that, that we've not been able to have an equal share of the benefits of this greater interconnectivity that we have on our economies. And so we've seen a decline in manufacturing in the developed world. We have seen medium skills being outsourced. But what we have seen in the developing world is that they have specialized in export-basic commodities in most of the cases. Others have focused only on a few productive sectors, and this has not had a benefit for the whole society. And this has also led, in those parts of the world, to greater inequalities, although recognizing that the economic impact is positive. So one of the things that we've been saying is that it is necessary to move towards diversifying the economy, and it's important to make sure that this diversification makes the economies more robust regarding global fluctuations, increased labor productivity, but also that it needs to be translated into better wages and better living standards. So this is not globalization equals devil. Globalization needs to be tamed in terms of what it is producing for everyone in the globe. The second driver is the whole debate around technological change. We have seen that the impact of that, and it is translated in various forms, we've discussed those as well, has been restructuring production, and this has been affecting both the quantity of work, but also the quality of working conditions and the nature of work itself. There's a clear impact on these 3 aspects. And we also tend to agree, and that was part of the debate in the course of these 2 days, to say that it's not just the impact on the quantity of employment that matters, but it's mostly the composition that matters. And what we have seen is that there is a further polarization of the labor force. And this polarization has a very negative impact, for instance, on gender equality. I would say it has promoted gender inequalities instead of gender equality. And it has also exacerbated overall wage inequalities. And I'm not going to repeat the gender issue, but it is present throughout all the points that we have been discussing. There is a clear gender dimension in this debate on the future of work, and it needs to be addressed with all its merit, and it needs to be taken up as one of the main important issues that we need to do in terms of how do we move from here. The third driver is linked with, shrinking in population in the developed world and also in parts of the developing world, but also the fact that we have seen a rapid population growth in many parts of the world, which can be positive in itself, but what it's a problem is the fact that you've got an increase of 40 million additional workers entering into the labor force every year, and they don't have jobs for them. So how do we handle also this driver? And the fourth and the last one is the whole debate around the environment, which also needs to be taken into consideration in all these discussions. We have seen that industrialization in many parts of the world, and I'm not talking about the Paris Agreement and all the rest, but we have seen that industrialization in many parts of the world, and the fact that the population is also expanding in many parts of the world has led to an environmental degradation, and it has led to a very dangerous warming of the planet. And we see that every day on events that we see every day across the globe. And so the consequences that this is going to have and is having already in the world of work and in the livelihoods of the global population also have to be addressed in our discussions on the future of work. So I think one of the first things we can say is that addressing the challenges around the future of work is not something that anyone can ignore. And the timing of this initiative is also crucial in the sense that it has an impact, whatever decisions are taken in that regard, it will have an impact in the quality of our democracies. And we heard that in our first special dialogue on politics. And it will have an impact on the current multilateral processes, and it will influence positively or negatively the trends and the drivers that we have been discussing over the course of these 2 days. So this is not something that trade unions and workers' organizations can address as a plus to what they do. It's something that needs to be an integral part of the reflection and of the action of workers' organizations on their daily activities. And they also have to look more seriously at the larger macroeconomic and social developments that influence the world of work. So looking at it just from a micro perspective is no longer enough. There's got to be the wider capacity to look at all these elements from a macro perspective as well. So what we've done at the symposium and at the regional conferences is to see how, from a workers' perspective, we frame this future of work debate. We have all understood that the situation is not the same in every country and in every region. It's a very heterogeneous situation, and that needs to be taken into account. But that should not prevent us from discussing with governments, with the social partners, and with the ILO, how can we make sure that the way forward is one that promotes social justice and that promotes the rights of working men and working women. And these were, I would say, the shared drivers that we've been discussing and the rationale that allowed us to start and move into the dialogues. Now, the main points that we have selected, and as I say, you probably don't agree with all of them, but that's life. But we have gone to 4 main points. And in each one of these main points, there are a lot of things that can be brought in the way we handle those main points. I think one first thing to say, and that again we could see in our discussions, is that it's not just academics or government representatives that are clearly aware of the scope of the challenges that lie ahead in terms of what needs to be done, but that workers' organizations are very much aware of those challenges as well. And they're very much aware of the fact that they need to address those challenges in their capacity and in their interaction as social partner. And that this needs to be highly profiled in the future. And that workers' organizations not just need to address that, but they need also to address how do they relate to other stakeholders. I mean, there was not a big debate on the wider civil society, but that's part of the discussions as well. And how do they relate with the governments? And how do they, and I think that was something that was very clear also coming out of the dialogues, how do unions reassess their methods, their working methods, their objectives, and also how do they keep on promoting, with all these challenges in a very difficult life ahead of all of us, but how do they continue promoting the centrality of work, and how do they keep as the core business of a trade union organization the promotion of dignity of all workers in society? It's easier said. It's very difficult done under the current circumstances. So I think this is one of the first points that was clearly coming out of the discussion and where there was a very wide level of consensus. The other one is regarding social dialogue. We've talked a lot about social dialogue and we've all recognized the importance of social dialogue in addressing the rapid changes in the world of work. And again, another thing that was shared in the different dialogues was to say that issues are very complex. They're interconnected. And this implies that contrarily to some schools of thought that we are witnessing, the rule is not to operate on an individual setting. The rule will have to be the strengthening of the collective tripartite setting. And this is not a given either, because we have seen the evolutions in the way our societies and citizens and workers in those societies have been evolving. So the need to operate on a collective setting, on a collective tripartite setting, was very much put at the forefront of our discussions. Then there was a clear recognition that collective bargaining remains the main instrument for workers and employers' organizations to regulate the conditions at the labor market level, but that's not enough. Workers' organizations need to have high qualitative collective bargaining, but they also need to have a very strong and very clear voice in shaping social, economic, and environmental policies at the national level, but also at other levels, depending on the region you are in and depending on the dynamics of integration processes at that level. So workers' organizations have to have the capacity to influence what are the plans at national level in this regard, but also the plans at the regional integration processes levels. And by doing this, they're not saying that the state does not have a role. They're saying that the state, yes, does have a very important role. And the important role of the state in this regard is not just to create the conditions for that dialogue to exist, but also to guarantee that workers' organizations have access to information, have access to consultation, have access to participation in those processes, and that the state must abide by existing national and international regulations. They need to protect, via those regulations, labor rights, but they need to do something more. And that's part of our discussions as well. It's not just to do with what we have. It's also to see where do we need to extend national regulation. And that's something which also came out in our discussions very clearly. The other point that was discussed was the advancement of technological innovation. And this is a very important point as well. It is very important because we have seen that the negative externalities of what we call artificial intelligence, machine learning, in the labor market are not generated by technology itself, but are rather a matter of an ethical and a sustainable use of new technologies, and that there's got to be regulation accordingly. And I think that this is something that came out in our discussions and how we move forward this ethical use of technologies, and how do we make its use sustainable, and at the same time, how do we make sure that there is regulation that needs to be put in place for that coming out of all this discussion. But having said that, I think that it came out also as a very strong concern by all participants, the whole debate around automation and the digital economy. And it came because the disruptive effects that we are seeing of the digital economy on workers cannot be ignored, quite the opposite. We have said that these platforms operate mostly outside the classic normal labor regulations, and we have said that workers in the digital production processes are a further category of invisible workers in terms of regulation, that this facilitates non-standard forms of employment, and of course, consequently, it puts pressure on wages, but also on companies that operate in the formal economy and that want to operate through fair competition and not unfair competition that they suffer from with the current processes. So what can we do in order to protect workers in non-standard forms of employment that are often excluded from social protection, that are often excluded from on-the-job training, that at the same time are more vulnerable relative to workers that have a formal employment relationship. And of course, one of the things that was equally shared by all the dialogues was to say that in order to adapt to the fast-paced of technological change, and no one is saying that it needs to stop, but in order to address the disruptive effects that this has on the employment relationship, it is vital to strengthen social protection schemes. It is vital to provide equal access to quality education and skills development as two of the areas that were flagged up, but there are certainly others that can be added to this. The third point was the fact that participants have stressed the importance for trade unions to reassess strategies to expand beyond their traditional member base and to be able to support the collective organization of workers within new forms of work and also within informal employment. This is moving away from what has been the traditional way of work for union organizations, but we all need to recognize that unionization is shrinking in many parts of the world, and the extension of union work and membership to workers outside the formal employment relationship will be key to ensure that unions are able to continue fulfilling their role in promoting social justice and decent work for all. And it was said by many of the speakers that this also includes reassessing internal strategies in order to allow for a larger share of non-standard workers to be organized collectively and also to see their work formalized. The fourth point that we also discussed extensively in the different dialogues was the implications of the large macroeconomic trends that accompany globalization. And many participants have said very clearly that international competition should not be to the detriment of labor rights, to the detriment of working conditions, and also to the detriment of implementing fiscal policies that foster a broader and sustainable economic development. And what we have said and we have seen and observed is that the increasing competition for foreign investment, which is out there, has led to a race to the bottom behavior among countries. And this is putting pressure on labor standards and on union representation, because the main aim is to accommodate foreign investors and not to take care of how these investments will have to be developed at the national level. So the whole question of a better regional integration has been flagged up in some of the cases. The need for a stronger coherence between international organizations in order to regulate the increased internationalization of capital and multinational enterprises, and also the respect and the promotion of decent work. So these were, I would say in a nutshell, the points that we have observed across the different dialogues that we have. And I have to say that the debates that we've had were all very constructive, were all very insightful, and have led us to have what I would expect you agree with me is a more or less clear strategy towards how we move from here, and that's what I'm going to address now. We have identified 6 points on the way to move forward, and as I said, these 6 points should influence the further debate. They should be included in the action plans that we have to develop, and they should also be advocated as extensively as possible, depending on our capacities and where we are sitting. The first one, and it's building on what I've just said, is that trade unions have to evaluate their approach in terms of their internal methods and also in terms of how they develop their bipartite and their tripartite relationships. They need to fulfill their role as an advocate of progressive policies. They need to be able to shape and be an active participant in the democratic processes, because that's the only way to drive sustainable development and to guarantee decent work for all. The second point is on social dialogue, and I think we all agreed that social dialogue has to be actively enhanced. And it was said that this is not a question of creating new institutions, because in most of the cases, they are there, they exist. Problem is, how do we make sure that these institutions lead to a qualitative social dialogue and to results that make a difference? So there was a debate about how do we define or redefine, I would say, the scope of social dialogue. How do we strengthen the capacities of the tripartite engagements? And how do we make sure that the autonomous role of the social partners is respected and promoted? And it is quite clear that in the light of the new forms of work and the new forms of production, that also blurs somehow the definition, or what we have known as a definition of employer and worker so far. How do we make sure that instruments that are already out there, because we don't need to invent a lot, are better used? And we were mentioning the potential offered by international framework agreements. Or do we make sure that, how do we make sure that the governance mechanisms recognize at the forefront the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining of all workers? So on social dialogue, there is a lot to be done in terms of making systems and processes more qualitative and getting to concrete results. The third one is, of course, on the efforts that have to be done to organize and formalize new forms of employment. Well, we talk about new forms of employment, but in reality, some of these new forms of employment resemble practices from the past. So they're not that new in the way they are being promoted. What is really the challenge today is that we are seeing a widespread fragmentation and a widespread individualization of employment, and the implications that this has for workers and for the coverage and the effectiveness of our social protection schemes that are tied to formal employment. Let's be honest, that's how they were constructed. And they're also tied to a formal employment relationship and to the collective bargaining power of workers. All this needs to be revisited because the circumstances have changed. And so this is a huge challenge. Now, we have seen, and some colleagues have talked about positive examples of action, of collective action among crowd workers, which have been organized and actively supported by trade unions. And certainly, one of the ways to follow up on this is to go and bring those examples out in the open and to share them as much as it is possible. But it's also true, and it was recognized, and I want to insist on this point, that unions also need to further assess their internal methods on how to integrate the workers who are not in a formal employment relationship and how they can contribute to formalize their work. The fourth point is the active promotion of strategies that change the economic structures of the global economy. And we have said this has got to include striving for greater sectoral diversification to boost employment and wages, which will also lead into a higher internal demand and investment in lifelong learning strategies. These are key in order to move forward. And this would also support emerging countries in being less reliant on the fluctuations of the global growth rates and the prices. And so unions cannot just advocate this from their headquarters. They have to be part and parcel of the design and of the implementation of the integration processes and of the trade agreements at all levels. This is a condition for that to happen. Fifth point, and I'm almost there, is the need to have a greater coherence when it comes to policies that promote the sustainable development of economies. We've said it. Social and environmental policies have to be given the same importance as economic policies. They're not a result that derives from economic policies. They have to have the same standing at all levels. And we had a good special dialogue on the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that regard, the capacity to provide this greater coherence or to have a coherent strategy is given to us by the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a clear set of goals, there are targets, and then how we are able to translate that at the national level, but also the implications this may have at the regional and the international level can provide a framework on how the world of work can respond to the drivers and trends affecting the future of work. So it was clear that in our discussions we were linking the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda with the agenda on the future of work. And this is a huge challenge because this requires an active involvement of trade union organizations, but this also involves the political commitment, and this also involves the financial means to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals are amalgamating with national development strategies and ensure that the future of work is based on decent work and sustainable development. And in this regard, we come back to the role of the state that I have mentioned earlier in the course of our conversations, because the state has to guarantee and to fulfill its role as a promoter of economic and social and environmental cohesion, as a promoter of equality, as a promoter of the protection of the rights of workers, but also respecting national and international laws, the regulatory frameworks, and extend regulation to cover new emerging gaps. And this is part of the ongoing and the future discussions in that regard. Now, the last point. We are the ILO, and we have done all these discussions in the context of the ILO and in the context of the Centenary initiatives, and especially on the Future of Work initiative. And I think we've all said that the ILO and its role is imperative. It is imperative for ensuring that its mandate of social justice is present in each and every policy that affects the world of work. And of course, this includes upholding existing standards, but also addressing potential gaps in the regulatory framework. And of course, the ILO has a specific responsibility regarding regulation, but it also has a specific responsibility in strengthening the compliance with international labor standards and the promotion of social protection and social dialogue. So we also have to do our homework in this regard and to continue promoting this agenda. So, friends, I would just like to end on a note to saying that this is not the end of a discussion. This is the beginning of a discussion that we'll have to move on. And the Future of Work Centenary Initiative is an extraordinary opportunity for all of us to build the future of work we want, and as I said at the outset, it is imperative that we carry on this strategic debate forward in order to ensure that the ILO is fulfilling its mandate for social justice and decent work for all, and putting the dignity of workers at the center of the debate, but also in order to make sure that trade unions continue playing a vital role in shaping the political process and in making the voices of workers heard at all governance levels. So I hope we have been, because I did not write this all by myself, but that we have been in our drafting team more or less faithful to what our discussions, very rich discussions, have led us to discuss in the course of these 2 days, and also building on that we have learned from the regional conferences. And I would now like to turn to our 2 guests. I would like to turn first to Luc and ask him, does this make sense? Is this an agenda? Is this an agenda that you in your chair now and in your new capacity can embrace and help us move forward.
Yeah, thank you. And congratulations to ACTRAV and to all of you for your discussions and your analysis, and also for the 6 points in moving forward. They are a very important and very interesting input for us also in the work that will follow in the Global Commission. I want to give some comments. I will tell you now, Director General, of course I will speak in my own capacity and not in the name of the governing body of the ILO. I have to be careful because there are different roles, but I can tell you that I'm not someone different than before. Let me turn to the analysis. And of course, the new technologies with the digitalization, robotics, artificial intelligence, these are important, but we have to see them, we have to look to them in a global context. And so this discussion about the future of work reaches us in times where certainties disappear or disappeared. Following the ILO Index 2015-2016, there's an overall strong rise of social turmoil. Middle classes have a sense of no longer belonging to a society in progress. Multiculturalism is felt as a menace and not as an enrichment. And a lot of people, 201 million, are without a job, and we know the facts and reality of underemployment. We know the precarious and informal work is rising. And so you have some frustration in societies, you have some helplessness and anger, and that's ventilated by social media, and these are stepping stones, in fact, to populism, to nationalism, to protectionism. And globalization was a positive trigger in countries and subregions who regulated it. But the overwhelming policy of non-regulation left us with disastrous effects. And this shockwave is reaching us, and it reached us already, but it is reaching us more now. And our societies, I think, are paying a high price for it. And this is the problem, that this is the bottom, the ground on which the future of work is sown. And the international political, economic and social community cannot make the same mistake again. The future of work has to be a regulated one. And also I think that we have to look to the future of work in a broad perspective. I'm always speaking about 7 challenges. Maybe it are 8 or 10 or 11. But okay, we have, of course, the effect of the new technologies. And I think we do not have to fight against the new technologies. It makes no sense. And they can be helpful in eradicating precarious work. And of course, we learned from history, and we had already these discussions between us, Guy and Maria Helena. The question is what will be if we looked back, if you're looking back to the new technologies. Every time we feared that we would have less employment afterwards. We had a lot of transition, and we had a lot of problems with transition. But now the problem is that we are not sure at all in which direction, but it will affect us. It will affect, and it will affect middle-skilled people and in our workers group. So, but we have to be honest. We do not know. We know that we will have to work with the fragmentation, with different forms of labor markets, the e-platforms, the crowd businesses, and so on. So that's one. I want to add a second one, and that's the need for jobs. We need jobs. I think it was Deborah Greenfield who told us, and you too, at the start of this symposium, okay, people need to show that they have values and that they want to do something in the world. That it's important for society, but it's also important for themselves. So we need more employment. But who will work for this? Which policy has to be followed to come to this? And this brings me immediately, and I'm not going into all these subjects, you discussed a lot about all this, but the third issue is, of course, migration. It brings us immediately employment, migration, and we see very well if you compare it with the demographics and you look to the industrialist countries, there we have old people, we have old regions, and then we are looking to the developing and emerging world. There we have young people, but less opportunities. Older generations with more prosperity, other regions with less prosperity. So it will lead to migration. The question is, how do we regulate this? Increasing inequality, I will not tell you a lot about, you know it very well, okay, we know how important this is. This is a fifth one. A sixth one is the sustainable development, but also the climate problems. And it was Deborah Greenfield who told us the first day that if we are looking to the 110 country discussions, it was one of the issues that we less discussed, in fact. And I know, of course, we all also as unions, we have very good resolutions on all of this, but we are not working really with this problem. So we have to look to this too. I think it's also, that's a sixth challenge. And the seventh challenge is the economy and the companies. Of course, if we are looking to the financial world and the private equity funds and the hedge funds, they are forcing companies to deliver short-term profit. And shareholder value became the world, the expression. It's the prime concern. But of course, if we're looking to the share economy, they are going faster in this direction, meanwhile refusing to pay taxes and to pay the social systems everywhere in the world. So we have the global supply chains. We know, and it's also in your conclusions, of course. So I think we have some answers. About this, we had the discussion in the ILO-ACTRAV last year about the global supply chains. We have the M&E declaration, and I think we have a lot of interesting issues that we discussed, and we have some outcome too. But also the question will be, what will be the governments of this financial world? What can we do from the ILO? But can we do, DG, from the ILO all of it? How do we have to work with all these other institutions? So these are 7 challenges. If I'm then going to these six, if I'm turning to the, so let's turn, about these 7 points, we have to handle them all. We have to, I think that we need to have a broad vision. It doesn't facilitate the work, of course, but I think we need to do it, to go for a broad vision. And if I'm looking to different, but maybe certainly you can tell us more, Guy, but I think that if I'm looking to the work of, there's no international institution at this moment that's not discussing the future of work. But the most of them, they're only speaking about technology, digitalization, and so on. And I think the added value coming from us could be that we would speak about all these issues. So then I'm turning Maria Helena to your six points and to your 6 points. So trade unions have to evaluate, that's the first point, their approach in terms of internal methods. And now I'm one who worked in the union challenges or act. Mostly the people with better situations. Understand this. The people in the public sector. What will we do with working in minor statutes? In fact, working for the public sector, but coming from the private and working in the private sector. In fact, they are in competition with what we call the real public sector. How do we organize them? It's a difficult question. What will be our attitude to people who are bogus independents, or people engaged by e-platforms, compared with the people with the standards, contracts. And so the question is, fighting against some of these formats, does it mean also that we fight against the people who are in these formats, working this way? This is really a difficult question, and we have good examples, and Tim can explain us, and we have different good examples for this. But it is not generalized, and we have to look to all of this. How do we organize these people, how we take them up, and how do we bring them in normal or in more protected systems? We will not avoid the evolutions, and or be prepared for this, and I know already how it works. Okay, but are they paying the same contributions as we? They're not paying the same contributions. Of course, they cannot pay the same contributions. Are we open to these discussions? This is really internal union thinking and union work. We have to really to discuss it within our organizations. If we want to play a role in the new bipartite and tripartite relationship, we have to think about this. Not only thinking, but also acting. Secondly, social dialogue has to be actively enhanced, and of course we have the institutions, and that's what you mentioned. We have the institutions, but okay, we have. You mentioned also the collective bargaining and the problems we have with collective bargaining, the gender gap, and so on. And what I'm feeling is that in all our societies we are losing influence on all the rest. Not okay. You have the discussion of wages, but and labor relations in general. But if you look to the general situation, to the economic situation, to the social security, for example, we are losing influence on all these systems. And this is important too. And of course, we will only be credible if we reinforce our representativity. That's important. That's on one hand. I will come immediately to the second hand, because immediately we will have the reactions, yes, but of course, unions are less important than they were before. Okay, let's look to the employers' organizations. In fact, they have the same problem. They are not representing all the employers. If I'm looking to the governments, they have a lot of problems at this moment to make new governments. They are working with very difficult coalitions and so on. So we all, the three groups are in problems. And we have some problems, and we have to work on this. But only telling that we are not, how do we call it, the workers are not, or the unions are not fit for purpose, but the others, we are. So we have to, and then then I have some upcoming pain in my stomach if I hear some ideas as tripartite plus. Of course, we have issues where some NGOs are better in than we. That's true. We need to work with them. That's true too. But the question is how to... There is a difference between a social partner making an agreement and being responsible for this agreement towards employers, towards the workers. That's an engagement, that's a commitment, that's different than NGOs have to do. So, okay, cooperation, yes, but the role of workers and employers will remain important also in the bipartism, tripartism of the future. So it's a second one, the second point of view. Difficult to organize the new methods of work. Of course, how will we regulate these new forms of employment? But we have to do it, that's for sure. And there, I will look immediately to the DG. What we need to, I think it will be also one of the points of the next discussion. But I think if, okay, I was union worker and leader, and we are working in our all day. We have to be feed. We have to be feeded. We have to be by who can do it better than the ILO. What are the evolutions? We do not know what the evolutions are at this moment. We need a very well-made follow-up by the research of the ILO, also helped by other organizations and so on. But there is only one organization that can feed us in this, in all the evolutions that we will. And then this could be a preparation for our work in the future too. So I think research will be very important too. Relationship with social security, social protection, I told it already. Yeah, who will pay for the social system? You have the tax evasion. All these new companies, they are not discount business and so on, they are not paying. Governments, to attract some money, they lower the taxes. That's the response given by a lot of governments at this moment. So companies do not have to pay anymore, or they have to pay less anyway. And the question is, who will pay for this in the future? So if there is not the relationship with employment, how, or less, how can we do this? And there I think that that this is one of the issues very difficult if the IMF is going to Romania and telling to the government and the government following it that employers do not have to pay any more for the social security, where we are at that moment. This is really important. So, okay, we have your fourth point. I think yes. Okay, the company level, the new economic structures, the global economy. We talked already about this. What will be our role and what will be the role of others? Okay, and okay, I think that we have to think more and to discuss more about trade agreements and the role of standards in trade agreements. And what is, it's difficult, it's delicate, I know it, I know it very well. It's also in my country, it was a very difficult discussion, but okay, the question is, okay, how to integrate it and how to make and who will make the arbitration. Sustainable development, very important. I spoke already about the climate change and that we have to play a more specific role in this as unions too, I think. And also you made the relationship in your point 5 with the social development goals. Very well, very good, very important. But my feeling is that unions, workers in general, do not feel where their place is in this discussion. Where are we at national level? Where are we at regional or at international level in this? Here we can have the discussion in the ILO, but for the rest I do not see it. It's not translated. Also in countries who have the method already of social dialogue, I do not see that this is discussed with social partners. So, okay, sustainable development. And then 6, the role of the ILO, the standards, the policy, and let's, okay, and there, I talked already too long, but we have, I do not think that we have to rethink the Constitution. I do not think that we have to remake the declarations. The Declaration of Philadelphia, for example, as one of the beautiful examples. Look to this. It could be written for these times, for all times. The question is how we translate it. What can we do with our methods, with the standards? What do we have to change some of them? What are the instruments? How do we modernize the instruments that we have? And what are we doing to implement some of the existing instruments who are valuable also for our times? So I think that this has to be the work for the next months, and so the discussion and the thinking and discussions are starting here, as you told already. But let me end with this. I do not see a real alternative for the ILO. I do not see a real alternative for unions and union work and social dialogue and collective bargaining and so on. I think that we have to play our role, but I see also other organizations coming up, and the danger for us is that it would be real corporatistic organizations, small corporatistic organizations who would take our place. Let them not take our place. We have to be in the center of this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luc. Luigi?
Well, thanks very much, Maria Helena. Hello, everybody. Well, the first thing I want to do is to congratulate everybody whose work has led to this very full, very comprehensive set of issues that we're discussing this morning. I must say it's very helpful to me to listen to everybody here. As you probably know, the Global Commission on the Future of Work, which is the next big step forward in the ILO's own Future of Work initiative, meets for the first time this evening. So it's sort of nice to have a rehearsal, I suspect, of some of the discussions they'll be having tonight with colleagues here in this ACTRAV event. I was listening carefully to what you said, Maria Helena, listening to Luke too, and wondering how to frame my own comments, because actually I'm quite bewildered. Luke had 7 points, you had 6 points, there were 4 state-of-the-art points. So I don't know how many points I've got, really, so I'm just going to go in and say a few things. But I don't want to simply repeat everything that's already been said, and I could easily do that because I think, and it's very encouraging, that you've already put your fingers very much on some of the key issues ahead of us. So I'm going to sort of, come in on certain specific points which I felt were interesting, or perhaps where you might want to think a little bit further. Let's start with where you started, Maria Helena, with what you called the state of the art. And there you enumerated those 4 issues which we already, as from the beginning of this process, identified as what we've called the mega drivers of change: globalization, technology, demographics, and climate change action. The first thing that I found quite interesting is in the national dialogues that have taken place, and in some of what I would call the more thoughtful and the deeper national processes of reflection on the future of work, there's a 5th issue which has come out, which I didn't see at the beginning, but seems to me to be increasingly important. It hasn't come out in this discussion. And that is pointing towards the idea that in many societies, at least, we're experiencing a very fast change in societal values and preferences in relation to work. That perhaps people today and those arriving on the job markets today actually don't want exactly the same things from their working life, or to work in the same way as I did when I started or my parents did. Now, this is a difficult set of issues, but it's one that I hope our Global Commission will look to, because we have a whole discussion about work and society. I think we all accept, and it's there deeply embedded in the ILO Constitution, that work is about self-fulfillment, it's about development, it's about meaningfulness in life. The danger of this debate is people are retrofitting what they claim are people's preferences and values to the realities of a labour market. That is to say, you're getting a blurring of private time and work time, and they're retrofitting that reality. That's what people want. I think there's a danger of being tricked, if you like, in this debate, but it's a debate we have to have, and it's a debate, and I'll come to the diversification of work forms a little later on, which I think is going to be an important backdrop to the continuing future of work discussion in the ILO. Now, I want to say something about globalization, and Luke, what you said about the political circumstances, you too, Maria Helena, in which our debate is taking place. We all understand, I think, very, very well, that the dynamics of globalization are a very important conditioner of the future of work. And I suppose whether we have liked it or have disliked it, and there's been a bit of each, I think we've all assumed for the last, 3 decades or more, that globalization, and probably deepening globalization, was going to be a given for the future of work, for the foreseeable future. And that assumption, I think, is now, for political reasons, called more into question than at any time I can remember in the last generation. We see, a rise of populisms, of nationalisms, of sort of autarkic reactions, which, whatever you think of them, are almost universally hostile to globalization, at least in the way they're presented. And that's an interesting point for trade unions, because whilst I think we are deeply worried about some of the manifestations, many of the manifestations of populism and current political discourse, I think we have to acknowledge they have in their origins some of the same critiques that trade unions have made of globalization. And there, I think trade unions have a difficult job to do, particularly in respect of trade, of working out precisely what we want to say. Now, I know what the headline answer is. We want a fairer globalization. We don't want to stop globalization. That's always been the line. But we're going to have to work out very, very carefully what we think the correct forward path of globalization should be. Technology. A lot has been said already about technology, and I'm sure in our future of work process for the next 2 years, we're going to hear more than we really want to do about technology. I agree absolutely. No, sorry, I want to just feed back to the politics. Sorry, I've missed one important point. I'll come to technology. You know, it seems, and Luke, you said it very clearly, certainties have gone, confidence has gone, questioning of multiculturalism, questioning of all sorts of things in political discourse has disappeared. A lack of confidence, a feeling that the notion of social progress, a better tomorrow, has gone. And I feel that. I'm a European. I sit here, we see it. Take a look at President Xi's speech to the Congress of the Chinese Communist Party yesterday. You won't get that message. You will get exactly the opposite message. I have never seen, not for a very long time, a speech of such very clear confidence and purpose in the future. China has its own centenary goals. 2021, centenary of the founding of the Communist Party. 2048, founding of the People's Republic. Very clear goals, very clear sense of progress, massive optimism. I think we have to relativize sometimes the specifics of our own political discourse with the global discourse. And one of the great challenges of our future of work reflection will be making sure that it is universally applicable and relevant. I just wanted to make that point in parenthesis. Back to technologies. I agree fundamentally what has been said about making sure that the necessary focus on technologies does not crowd out all other issues as we look at the future of work. There is this tendency to rush towards what we have called technological determinism. That is to say that the onward march of technology is going to decide more or less everything, and we'll just be passengers in the process of technological change. That's wrong, and I agree with what has been said about, in the first place, not believing we can just stand in the path of technology, but managing technologies, handling technologies in ways which mean that we can extract the maximum benefits from technological innovation, and they are self-evident benefits, but at the same time handle the negatives, which are equally evident. So we do have to place technological innovation in the wider context, as we have been urged to do. In the same line of thinking, if we reduce the discussion on technology to how many jobs are going to be created, how many are going to be destroyed, you know, the Schumpeter equation of creative destruction, we'll miss the major point. Now, that's a very important point, the quantitative dimension, but I think there is a much more important qualitative dimension to the discussion. That has not only to do with the distributional aspects of the benefits and costs of technological innovation, but it has also to do with the capacity which a new wave, call it the Fourth Industrial Revolution, if you please, the capacity that it has, by the nature of the technologies involved, to transform the way in which work is done. Now, we are seeing, and this brings me to the point of diversification of work forms. We know very well, and for quite a long time now, that there is a growing diversification of the ways in which work is undertaken. Now, let's not forget that a very high proportion of the world's workforce operates in conditions of informality, too often forgotten as we look to the future, but that's a massive challenge for the future of work. But yes, we're seeing, and this attracts enormous attention, the growth of the platform or the gig or the shared economy, call it what you will. But at the same time, we're seeing a growth of different types of part-time, temporary work, subcontracted work, agency work, 0 hours contracts, mini jobs. There's such a long list of vocabulary involved that it's sometimes difficult to grasp it all. Now, this has been the subject of debate in the ILO, not just for the last couple of years. It's been a subject of debate for a number of decades in the ILO. Look back to the record of adoption of international labour standards back in the 80s and the 90s. We had the adoption, of course, of the Convention on Private Fee-Paying Work Agencies, but we also had the adoption of conventions on home working, on part-time working. We failed in the attempt to adopt a convention on contract work. This is not perhaps as new a discussion as we might believe, but I do believe it's reached a new point in the discussion. By the way, it's interesting that whilst the Convention on Employment Agencies has received a respectable number of ratifications, those on part-time work and home working have not. And one might speculate why that is the case. But let me turn to the current state of that debate. I'm going to be very honest with you. I think the debate in the ILO on diversification of work forms has been largely a lost opportunity, rather a non-meeting of minds. It's boiled down to something, and I'm going to caricature to make my point. It's sometimes boiled down to the following. An employers group saying diversification of work forms is good, it offers opportunity, it offers freedom, it offers new opportunities to reconcile professional with private responsibilities. It's part of modernity. Yes, enterprises need it as well, but there are wider social benefits and advantages to be harvested. So they've pretty much got their foot on the accelerator on this one. At times, I think trade unions have been sort of corralled into a position of saying the only way to ensure job quality, decent work, is to reinstate the, let's call it the standard employment form, as the only acceptable option. It's a bit like putting the genie back in the bottle. And they point, and quite rightly, you point to the fact, and it's something we have documented, and we've been criticised for it. We have documented the very clear empirical evidence of the disadvantages accruing to workers of being in part-time work, of being in temporary employment situations. Deficits in terms of wage penalties, deficits in terms of access to social protection, deficits in terms of training possibilities, deficits in terms of career development. But we haven't really had much of a meeting between those two positions, and I think we need to have it. I think we need to have it. And as I read, again, the more thoughtful, the more profound approaches to the future of work, there is a real attempt by some, you might not agree with what they say, to try to square this circle, to say that if we're going to live in a future where work is undertaken in more diverse settings and in more diverse institutional frameworks, there's an attempt to define the types of institutions, the types of legislation, the types of regulation, Luke, you referred to the need for regulation, that would be required to ensure that diverse forms of work do not carry with them the penalties in terms of decent work conditions that we see today. And I could quote a couple of examples, but I won't because it will probably be unhelpful to you. But we do see serious discussion about the need to create, in law, new employment status categories, dependent contractors, for example, and all the rest of it. So these are things we need to think about, I think, and I'm sure they will appear in the discussion on the future of work. Turning, this really isn't my business any longer, but turning to the future of trade unions and how trade unions need to react in all of this. When I was in a position to say something about these things when I was working in the trade union movement, I often slipped into my speeches the thought that for organisations dedicated to changing the world, trade unions weren't always that good at changing themselves. I meant it as a calculated provocation. It still is, really. And I think it's true. I think it has the merit of being true. And it's very difficult to change. And Luke, you've talked it at greater length than I'm going to about the difficulties involved. Particularly difficult to change when you're under pressure. You feel under attack. You're under criticism. You know, the tendency is to dig your heels in and just keep on going because that's how life is. I really understand that. It's been my personal experience as well. But there are tough questions out there, and I think trade unions will benefit by embracing the types of challenges that have been identified. You know, extending membership bases, looking to the new work forms, that difficult challenge of organising in sectors and forms of work that we don't like the existence of itself. It's a bit of a dilemma. From there, social dialogue. You know, it's almost axiomatic. You would be sort of shown the exit door if anybody in the ILO said we don't believe in social dialogue and strengthening it. Of course we do. Yes, most of the time institutions are in place, not always, or if they are, they're not used properly. It's how to give form and substance and consequence to social dialogue. You know, I think that one of the best arguments in favour of social dialogue is not the raw principles that the ILO sometimes just pronounces as saying social dialogue is by definition a good thing. It's to show it works. It's to demonstrate and showcase and highlight the achievements of social dialogue. And these aren't imaginary. You look at the record of the 2008 crisis, those countries, or if you want to go back further, the Asian crisis in 97, those countries who came out better were those who had strong institutions, mechanisms of social dialogue. You know, people will judge us, and I think it's true of society in general, on the basis of the results we're able to achieve. So I think we really have to play on that key, and I think it's a winning argument. You do hear social dialogue sometimes sort of denigrated. I've heard it described as a conspiracy against good decision making because it involves compromise, it involves time, when all of the, you know, the ethos of our time is to go quick and hard and make decisive and sort of top-down decisions. There's just a simple defence of principle and of experience to be made. I find it very difficult to understand a situation which we often find ourselves in this organisation and in member states, of an employer community, certainly in this House, which strongly defends a practice of tripartism and social dialogue and then declines the option of collective bargaining. There's a small contradiction involved in that which I think might usefully be pointed to more sharply. Luke gets a stomachache when it comes to tripartism plus. And we don't want you to have a stomach. We're going to give dinner tonight, so we don't get a stomachache. I think we really give ourselves an unnecessary stomachache on this one. I've always been very, very clear on this one. And I have always tried to discourage those who, at some times or other, have been critical of the presence of NGOs and civil society in the work of the ILO. I think our doors need to be open, our ears need to be open, we need to embrace the role that civil society NGOs can have in the ILO, which has to be properly defined. And it's, in my mind, very clearly and quite easily defined if we care to do it. And I depart from Luke's fundamental point that the social partners, membership-based organisations of workers and employers, by definition, hold the representative mandate for working people and employers. When I hear NGO speakers, as they sometimes do, say, I represent, you know, all of a category of people who they claim to represent, I sort of wince. Where does the claim to representation come from? just the virtue of the merits of my discourse? Is it self-awarded? There is no representative mandate. So the representative mandate, and thereby the involvement of workers' and employers' organisations in tripartite decision-making in this organisation and elsewhere, to my mind, is unchallenged and unchallengeable. That good decision-making, good tripartite decision-making can be informed and supported by active engagement of civil society, I take to be equally self-evident, and I think we are all advantaged by going down that road. But I do take the point that if there's a lack of clarity about role and mandate, then we might get ourselves into stomachache territory, which I think is quite easily avoided. I'm coming to an end because I'm speaking too long. I'm very pleased that issues of migration and mobility came into the discussion. Luke, you mentioned it. This is one of the big stories, not only in the ILO, but in the international community for the next year. The United Nations is engaged, and I have the impression it's going to be a difficult and painful process in the elaboration of a global compact on migration, one on migration, another one on refugees. They've got until next September in the General Assembly to conclude that work. For the reasons that have been pointed out, differential demography, differential development trajectories, human mobility is going to be a big part of the future of work. And the question is, can we extract the benefits from that for the people who move and for the societies who send and receive people? Or is this going to be a constant effort to manage a crisis and a problem? We have it, I think, within our capacities to make migration a very positive part in all senses, positive for the people, positive for the societies who receive. We have the capacity to make this a positive story, but we're quite a long way from being able to do so right now, and I think we have to make major progress. I'm somewhat less negative, Luke, than you might feel about the extent to which the climate change issue has been assumed by our tripartite constituents. It is interesting, and I think Deborah was right to point it out, that in the national dialogues, climate change issues did not figure very prominently. I think that's a very fair and acute observation. My counter-observation would be as if we were having this discussion on the future of work even 10 years ago, very few people would have talked about or thought about climate change. It certainly wouldn't be one of the mega drivers of change. So we've come an awfully long way. And by the way, the trade union movement has come an awfully long way. I think you've been, from frankly feet dragging to leadership in a decade. Again, I'm not trying to make this sort of a nostalgic event, but when I was running the ICFDU, we could not even endorse the Kyoto Protocol. We couldn't do it. We thought it would destroy jobs, so we weren't interested. Not the most glorious moment of our history, let me say. We've come an awfully long way. Okay, maybe it didn't come out in the national dialogues, and maybe these issues are still, being absorbed at the national level. But I would say, and the same is true of gender, Maria Helena, that side by side with the Future of Work Centenary initiatives, we have Centenary initiatives, a Green Initiative and the Women at Work Initiative, and they're going to feed into the Future of Work Initiative, which focus very, very carefully on climate change action and jobs, and of course the status of women, which is a whole different discussion, which I haven't got time to go into, but certainly don't wish to downplay the importance of. So, yeah, we've got a long way to go on climate change, but I think we've established, in a short space of time, remarkably strong foundations to move forward. Two last points, and then I really will and not take more of your time. It is quite right to say that the ILO is not the only international organisation which is focusing on the future of work. And I was just jotting down my list of other organisations. The World Bank, you might have heard Jim Kim last week talking about automation and the effects on employment. International Monetary Fund, the OECD, African Union, European Union, many more. Indeed, the United Nations. United Nations, has, the Secretary-General has identified the future of work of one of his so-called frontier issues, one of those issues, sort of horizon scanning issues, which the United Nations has also to address more effectively and more operationally. So what does that mean for the ILO? Should we be worried and annoyed that other people are talking about it, or should we be happy and encouraged? I'm happy and encouraged. I think we should seek to extract the fullest advantage from this much wider engagement and interest in the future of work. It does reflect just how fundamentally important these issues are in the world today. And there are 2 points to add to that feeling of encouragement and that positive reaction. The first is the ILO has got 2 comparative advantages that we must make sure we use effectively. If we don't, we'll get into trouble. The first is the simple fact that we have global membership, we are tripartite, and we have the mandate on work. I mean, these are things that nobody else can match in terms of capacity and legitimacy to do the future of work job. The second point is we got there first. I don't mean 100 years ago, although that's true, but no, we launched our initiative on the future of work in 2013. It's not a very long time ago, but we have been the first in line, and that has added to the other issues that I've mentioned to give the ILO both legitimacy as the leader on these issues, but also convening power. We have had, we do have, and up until this point we've been able to maintain our convening power. This is the place where the debate that matters will ultimately take place. Now, that's the situation today. There is nothing which inevitably says that will always be the case. We're going to have to fight for it, and we're going to have to show that we are, in this case, fit for purpose to be the leader on the future of work debate. And when this whole thing culminates, as it will, at the ILO conference in June 2019, we very much hope that all the rest of this international family will still be on board with what we're doing. The story will not finish in June 2019, but that's where we're aiming for at the moment. And that brings me to the last point. Luke, you said, let's not try and rewrite the Constitution, let's not reopen the Declaration of Philadelphia. I think I interpreted you correctly. And I think you have very good reasons for saying those things. Firstly, because the objectives, the values, the social justice mandate, we don't want to change it. It's our mandate. It's 100 years old. Why should it change? It's what we're about. And that argues very strongly for not reopening the historic sort of definitional documents of social justice. And the second point is, what happens if we were to reopen them? Does anybody really think that the Declaration of Philadelphia could be agreed by an ILO conference today as it was in 1944? I made, in my opening comments to this year's International Labour Conference, exactly that point. I said, all of you in this room subscribe and quote the Declaration of Philadelphia. If you were asked to sit down and negotiate it today, would you be able to do it? And I think everybody knows the answer is no. And people have to think why that is the case. So we have a risk of taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and that's probably best avoided. So the idea, and I will put my hand up and say it was an idea I put on the table in 2013, of a centenary declaration being the culminating point of this process, you know, and we need something, I think it needs to be thought about very carefully. When you have a centenary, adopting a centenary declaration seems like the right thing to do. It's like sending a birthday card on someone's birthday. It's the sort of thing you do. But if we think that it's dangerous or inappropriate, then what do we do? Because this cannot be a process with no consequence. It cannot be a process with no result. Now, we will get the interim result, but it's only an interim result, of the report of the Global Commission, which starts its work tonight. That will be delivered at the end of next year, 2018. And then in the centenary year, we have to use that report and see where it takes us when we get to the conference in 2019. Look, these will be things discussed in the governing body already, under your chairing. and we have to see where it takes us. So there you go. There's a million other things I could have talked about, but lucky for you, I'm not going to. I don't know how many points that was, 6, 7, 4 or 7, I don't know, but that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As it always happens when I'm chairing a session, we always go beyond the time that we had allocated for that session. Not your fault, but anyway, I think it's been very enlightening, all that we have been listening to. And I think that I draw out of all this discussion a capacity to move on exploring some of the points that we have been identifying in the context of the work we've been doing, not just with workers' organizations, because I think that's very important to reinstate. The result of our discussions has been the result of very frank, blunt, we said on the very first day, and open discussions with the academic community, with employers' organizations, with government representatives, and with trade unionists at the highest level. So I think that what I've heard from Luc and what we've heard also from the DG is not in contradiction with what we've been discussing, and I wouldn't expect that to be the case. But there are nuances. There are nuances on some of the things that we have put on table. And you will have seen that I never mentioned the Global Commission. The discussion on what's going to be the role or the results of the Global Commission were not our concern in this exercise. That's not our business. That's your business in the Global Commission. But our concern was always to flag up issues that we feel have got to be a source of concern in the work that the Global Commission will be developing. And I'm sure that in the run-up to the work of the Global Commission and in the follow-up work that we will be doing, we will certainly be looking at what can be the outcome of this Global Commission and how unions can have an ownership of that result as well, in terms of how this is going to influence not just the work of the ILO in the future, but the work that organizations will have to do in utilizing what may be the results of the Global Commission. So I don't think that at this stage our concern was to see what's going to come out of it. We would call it the thing as being the result of the Global Commission, just like we did with our modest contribution. We didn't know if we would call it conclusions or highlights, or we didn't call it anything. It's points for further reflection and for further discussion. But it will be important, whatever will come out of this Global Commission will be very, very important, because that's going to set an agenda for the future. And in setting this agenda for the future, the issues that we've been discussing are very relevant. Issues like how the global policies and politics are going to evolve. They have to be part of the concerns of the Global Commission. And we know that we're not living in an homogeneous world, quite the opposite. But also issues as to what are the political choices when you come to look at things like technological development, the negative impacts of globalization in the rise of populism and nationalism, which have been a source of concern and discussion in our regional meetings. But also, how do you address the rapid speed of change in the way the world of work is being organized today? And we say it's the rapid speed of change. We do not necessarily say that many of these things are completely new, because they are not. I mean, I recall in Europe discussing atypical forms of work from the early 90s already, and all the discussions of what we call today the non-standard forms of work. Well, we've been having them for many years. As you said, have we been able to address them completely? No, we haven't. Have the unions resisted many of the times? Yes, they have. So I think that the challenge today for the unions is how do you stop resisting but enter into the discussion and put the right proposals on the table, because that's got to be the way forward. And that's the challenge for the trade union organizations when we say that, okay, there is a need to look at the way unions operate. There is a need to look at the way unions are representing what I completely agree with are not necessarily the same wishes we had when we entered the labor market of the people who enter today the labor market. But there's one thing that we know people want, is a certain degree of security and to know where they put their feet, where do they stand. And I think that's exactly the same situation we had when we entered the labor market. So those are the areas of concern. How, accepting that people may want to work differently, and we know that many do, how are they protected? And how can they be part of the collective voice of trade unions when pushing forward in the capacity of having a meaningful and qualitative tripartite dialogue and influencing what's the shape of the models at national level, but also on how they can also via collective bargaining supplement what can be the terms and the conditions and the guarantees for workers who work under these forms. I think that's the challenge in the end of the day. And that's what I think workers' organizations have understood that they need to embrace as an agenda and move forward in that regard. And we will certainly continue working with that agenda at the top of our minds. Now, last thing I want to say, because we have already run over, DG, your time, and also the time we had allocated for this session, I just want to have a very quick word of thanks to all of you, to all of those that have taken an active role in these meetings, the politicians, the academics, the employers, the trade union leaders. And I think, as I said, we were able to have open, tough debates sometimes, but frank and straight to the point. I would also like to say that it has been a pleasure to involve in these discussions, and especially in the regional conferences, but also in the symposium, colleagues from the office, from other departments. And we've always done that. In the regions, we've done that with the regional offices and the directors of the regional offices and other colleagues. But here, I would like to have a very special word of thanks to Deborah Greenfield, to Azita, who's here today with us again, Manuela Tomei, Musa Umaru, you, DG, of course. But also, I would like to have a special word of thanks to Luc. I think it's good for him to go to this commission and to this dinner tonight with all these things banging on his head, and we're not making his life easier. But I think it's good to have that, and we will always be there to put more things banging in your head if you need. And then finally, I would like really to thank my colleagues in ACTRAV, all of them, but especially to my colleagues in our small future of work team. Michael is a young researcher that joined us in March, and he has embraced this work with great enthusiasm and with great professionalism, and I thank him very much for that. Mamadou has been our communication, well, he's our communication officer, but he has been giving a lot of publicity around this. And if you go to the ACTRAV website, you will see interviews that we did with people in the regional conferences. You will see the interviews that we have done during the symposium. You're going to see soon all the documents that we have produced in the run-up to this symposium here. And I think communication and our capacity to be able to communicate well is key in the success of getting the message across in the best possible way. Anna, of course, and the other colleagues in the team, but also the colleagues who are behind the stages, the colleagues who have allowed for you to come and who are there to solve your problems whenever you need. So a big word of thanks to my colleagues from the general services. We've got Lily, Anita, Veronique here, but there are others who have been involved. And old colleagues in ACTRAV. They've all been part and parcel of what I think is a successful initiative which needs to be moved on. So I'm very proud of the work that we have been able to develop as a team. And then my final word of thanks, of course, to the interpreters that have put up with us and allowed us for having a positive work. Thank you very much. Safe trip back home. And as I said, this is not the end of the conversation. This is the start of the conversation, and I count on you. Thank you very much.
Yes.